Suffice it to say that this is one of the world authorities on this particular aircraft. Somebody who's instructed other people in flying this very, very difficult to fly aircraft. He is associated with the Air and Space Museum and talks to people about the SR-71 via that venue. And what he's going to do today is basically three things. He's got a PowerPoint. You see that up on the screen here. He's going to work through that. Then he has a video that was produced by Lockheed. I'm going to start with the video? All right. All right. It's a slam bang video.
Flexibility is a key to airplane.
Yeah. Lots of fun action in this one. And then you want to finish up with the...
If they're not bored, again, it'll be another video.
Yeah, okay. The other video, stay tuned for that one. Many of you, if you know about this plane, and you too, you know there was a guy named Kelly Johnson who used to run Skunk Works at Lockheed, who is the father of both of these aircraft. And this final video is called Letter to Kelly, and it's a very moving tribute to this person who has been at the center, was at the center of virtually every important exotic aircraft that we built for a long, long time. All right, so without further ado, let's give it to Buzz.
Thank you, Jason. I'm delighted it was brief. I'm so glad that all of you are here today. As Jason mentioned, I'm the docent at the Air and Space Museum at the Uberhazy Center, and air museums, space museums around this country need all your support, and we need to engage the younger generations and get them excited about going into careers in teaching, become astronauts, becoming whatever that visiting a museum can often stimulate. So what I'm going to show you is this. We're going to start with 3 years ago, Lockheed had their 100th anniversary as a company, and they put together, they asked me and the Smithsonian, put together, they filmed it at the Uberhazy, a salute with the SR-71, but for Lockheed's 100th anniversary. It runs about 4.5 minutes, and then we're going to go into the PowerPoint briefing. So hit it, Jason, please.
The SR-71 is a combination of power and majesty. When you look at it, it just has a mystique that I think is going to live for generations and generations. I wish I could take everybody up to 85,000 feet, because you can see 350 miles in any direction. You can see the curvature of the earth. Mountains, 10,000 foot mountains look flat. I can say without a question is that people knew that there would be an SR flight, and when they cranked those engines, the Buick Wildcat would scream. Then when the SR engines came on, people from around the base would just kind of stop. 117 decibels, that's what the SR was on takeoff. Six presidents used the SR-71 extensively because they had a great sense of confidence that it could in fact go out, collect the information required, and bring it back. Hundreds of missiles were fired at this airplane. I couldn't tell you how many times fighters came up to intercept me. I remember part of our missions when I was flying in the late 70s was fly through rings of SA-5, so we knew it was a very capable missile system. They weren't concerned too much about the SR, but they were very concerned about others. And they figured we could collect enough information and we could understand how that missile system would work. If we carried the nose camera, which we call the country's camera, it took a picture 72 miles wide. In 64 minutes, you would film 100,000 square miles. The film itself was 10,500 feet long, 5 inches wide. I would say my mission into the Middle East for President Carter was one of the most interesting. It was supposed to be 3 missions, but we picked up all the targets in that first mission that they needed, so the next 2 missions were canceled. The airplane loved to fly straight and climb and accelerate. Most of the time at altitude, 80 to 85,000 feet, it was kind of like a nice Beamer or a Cadillac. But the airplane sensitivity was on a curve like this. So the faster you went, the airplane became much more sensitive and had to be handled much more delicately. The genius of this airplane was that the faster we went, it's the only airplane in the world, we burned less fuel. The greatest sonic boom that was ever set up, it was May 1972, 3 SR-71s took off from Okinawa, Japan, and simultaneously overflew Hanoi at the same time. I've talked to the POWs. They said it scared the living daylights out of the guards because they never heard a shock like that. It didn't sound like a bomb, and they actually fled. We called the shock wave that came across the ground the sound of freedom. Can you imagine that sometimes we were tasked to overfly foreign ceremonies, to boom heads of state when they were greeting each other, to remind them that they were doing things that were counter to U.S. policy? As I go around the country and try to visit and work with museums, there's a whole new generations of young men and women that are absolutely fascinated by this airplane. I was blessed in the Air Force because I was lucky to fly a number of Lockheed products. Lockheed was always there to bring in new innovation that met our needs as warfighters so we could better do our job. You know, it's a great celebration that in 100 years has led to new vistas that who could have predicted.
There had to be a commercial at the end of it for the 100th anniversary. I thought they did a pretty good job dressing me up, and of course all of these.
Stock footage they put in there.
Quitting?
It's quitting.
You want the PowerPoint?
Yes. I brought my backup from Smithsonian. But I'm not sure it'll reach out to this whole room.
Yeah, let's do this.
Testing, testing. The basic briefing you'll see today is the briefing we put together at the Smithsonian to send out to the 30 museums around the world, 29 of them here in the United States that have some form of a Blackbird, and 1 in England at the Royal Air Force Duxford Museum. And it gives them a basic background about the airplane, how it came about, and some of the things how we used it. It only slightly delves into the background of the A-12s, which was the predecessor, the single-seat airplane that Eisenhower originally approved, that was only operational for about a year, and they decided the airplane was just too demanding for one person. And if you look at the cockpit, you'll see our cockpit, and you'll look at that and you'll be amazed. Their cockpit was even more primitive. So this we're going to look through very quickly. I'll have questions at the end. So almost everything about this program is declassified. So don't be shy. There's no test at the end, so don't strain if there's a particular detail. We passed out those fun fact sheets just to kind of stimulate you on some of the things, achievements and capabilities of the airplanes. Background, spying and reconnaissance. Everybody calls the airplane a spy plane. Basically, it's a reconnaissance. A spy is something that's done covertly. And where did it start? It started with people going out collecting information. And then as technology came along, we were able to employ horses. You had your cavalry, balloons, And I do encourage you to come to the museum back there because it's absolutely fascinating. The first real use of balloons in a wartime situation was the Civil War. And they have some of the best examples about the Cold War Museum about the history of its use by the Union during the Civil War. We come up to World War I, we finally get aircraft. Early use of aircraft was really reconnaissance. And then one side said, wait a minute, I don't want those people taking pictures. So they decide to come up with a gun and try to shoot those other people down. So all along came fighters. And so now we have this competition between picture takers and fighters and then eventually bombers and everything else. World War II. Your Spitfire, 6 of them were modified by Winston Churchill as soon as he became the premier, and they started overflying Germany because they knew that war was probably imminent. And with that, they learned at high altitude, it's very cold and very moist. Now, we got the moist out here today, but we don't have the cold. And it really runs havoc with film because you get moisture in there, can spoil the image that's been taken, but more importantly, film sticks together, it jams, so you come back from a mission and none of your take worked. Cold War. President Eisenhower has a dilemma. Actually, Harry Truman started it. We tried to use military airplanes and modify them for a reconnaissance role. We lost over 14 airplanes and 140 crew members from the Army, Navy, and the Air Force flying either over the Soviet Union, Red China, or on its peripheral and ending up getting shot down. They needed something to fill this gap. The U-2 is the first airplane specifically designed to be a reconnaissance airplane and to do overflight. And this gets back to the amazing thing of Kelly Johnson. From the time he got the contract, 9 months later, had the first flight, test flight, and 20 months later, you have your first mission. I mean, by today's standards, it's absolutely unheard of. And when they got through with the first production run, I know Anna and Chuck here with defense business, Kelly Johnson actually wrote a check for the government for $25 million because they had underspent the budget. You know, today that just never happens. On the first, you know, we always like the 4th of July. So on the 4th of July, 1956, the U-2 flies over Moscow. It's seen on radar, which really surprised us. We didn't think the Russians could see an airplane at 70,000 feet. And the second thing, they see surface-to-air 2 missiles being deployed around Moscow and some of the military areas. And the CIA basically says, you know, we think those missiles can get up to 70,000 feet. And so they brief the president in early 1957. He said, create a commission. The commission came back in early 1958 and said, this is what we need. We need an airplane that doesn't fly at 70,000 feet, it flies at 85,000 feet. Doesn't fly at 450 miles an hour, flies at 2,100 miles an hour, and is America's first stealthy airplane, long before anybody had ever heard what that term was. Here's Kelly Johnson, 2 of his probably most famous airplanes, the U-2 and the SR-71. He looked at both these airplanes with tremendous pride and joy, and I was blessed. I was in the program from 1975 to 1981. And Kelly Johnson was not heading up the Skunk Works at that time, but he was still showing up for work. So I met him initially as a captain. And I was really glad I was a customer because Kelly Johnson could be rather gruff, to say the least. But the people that worked for him loved to work for him because they created things. In his life, he was a major contributor to over 30 airplanes in a lifetime. You know, today, if a designer can get 1 out, they feel that as a sense of accomplishment. I'm not going to read these to you. The secret to Kelly's is he had a tight team. They put everybody together so that all the different things that need to have a voice were in that room. And he had a good relationship with the government, but it was a tight relationship. You didn't have, as later on the 117, with the U-2 we had 4 government people in the plant. With the SR there were 8 government people in the plant. With the 117, the stealth fighter, there were 200 people in the plant. You know what that does for progress? Not much. Many other companies have adopted the Skunk Works methodology because they found it to be very productive. Just a quick, Kelly Johnson grew up in Michigan, graduated from the University of Michigan. Lockheed initially wouldn't hire him, so he got his master's there. He was a genius in aerodynamics. Lockheed finally hired him after he had a master's degree. He reworked Amelia Earhart's airplane because the Electra was unstable, changed the whole tail configuration. 1937, the XP-38, first prop fighter that could fly at 400 miles an hour. That's Kelly Johnson's design. I'm not going to go through the whole list, but I want to kind of show you his genius. If you look at 1938 there, the Hudson bomber, the British, the war was coming. They desperately needed some bombers. As a last thought, they said, well, why don't we invite Lockheed? We don't think they build bombers, but maybe they've got an idea. Kelly shows up on a Friday with 2 or 3 other engineers. He'd been basically misled on what the British needed. He gave the briefing, and the Royal Air Force kind of said, you know, this is what we really need and what you have here. And Kelly said, would you do me a favor? Will you let me come back on Monday, and I'm going to show you a new design that I think will meet your requirements. He worked through the whole weekend, probably slept very few hours, but he could, in his mind, create what needed to take place to meet your needs. He came in on Monday with the other 2. Before the meeting was over with, the British had bought the first 200 Hudson bombers, and before the war was over, you can see there's 3,500. You can see with the U-2, 9 months first flight, 20 months operational mission. SR-71, from the time Eisenhower approved it, August of '59, 32 months later, the A-12 had its first flight in Area 51. These are some of the awards. I'm not going to go into detail. He just had a very illustrious career with tremendous productivity.
That's just the
Kelvin,
yeah.
okay. Back to this one.
Testing, testing. I'll try to keep it close. Coming over.
Breaks up.
Testing, okay. The Lockheed Skunk symbol came from World War II. They were developing our first jet fighter, which would become the P-80, and they went to the Little Abner Comics and said, we want to use a symbol that if there's any security leaks around here, we'll smell it. So the skunk became the Lockheed, and is still the logo of the Lockheed Skunk Works today. What was the goal that Eisenhower laid out? Mach 3 plus 85,000 feet, above 80, and stealthy. So you ended up with a 3.3 Mach, which is about 2,150 miles an hour, 85,000 feet. The A-12 could go at 90,000 feet, and you have 1 square meter, that's the amount of surface that would reflect radar energy back. So this was a very difficult airplane to see on radar in the 60s and 70s, not by today's standard. The Oxcart was the A-12. There were 32 SR-71s built, which we're going to focus on. We lost 12 of them, and I'll talk more about the background on that. It's the last airplane built with a slide rule. Think about it. 1958, the president says build something like this. Were computers very mature? They were not. And part of the reason as you go forward why we lost 12 airplanes, there was no modeling and simulation. You had to go out and try it. Well, you know, sometimes it didn't work. And they'd come back and they'd say, well, in a parachute, the good news is, and one thing my wife particularly liked about this airplane, it had a magnificent rocket ejection seat. In the history of the SR-71 program, we lost 12 airplanes, but only 1 Lockheed test engineer was ever killed, and no Air Force crew member ever even suffered a serious injury having to leave this airplane when it was required. You'll see the temperature profile here in a minute, and because of that, an average temperature of over 600 degrees, you couldn't use aluminum. So titanium is 93% of the airplane. All the titanium came from Russia. They never knew who they sold it to. The CIA set up a frontal company in Europe. The Russians wanted money, and we wanted titanium. So we got all the titanium sponged from them to build these 12 airplanes. Because of the high temperature, we couldn't use regular fuel like you and I when we're on commercial airplanes. It's a special fuel. Most fuel lights at minus 40 degrees. JP7 lights at 335 degrees or above because you need a stable fuel. We had special tankers that had carried a special fuel for us. They were absolutely essential for our mission. Every 2 hours we had to refuel. Think about it. We go over 3,000 miles, but we needed tanker or tankers there to meet us. As we burned down the fuel in the tanks, we put gaseous nitrogen in there to prevent auto detonation. That's what it looked like. My pie window up here in the front, that little window was 620 degrees. My side window was 560 degrees. My navigator's windows were about 540 degrees. It's like your quartz glass. It's about an inch thick, like your oven. Even in the air-conditioned spacesuit, you can only hold your finger or your hand against the window for about 5 to 10 seconds, and then it was too hot. The airplane grows 3 to 4 inches in length, an inch or 2 in width because of heating. So it had to be put together uniquely, to say the least, and this was part of the challenge for Kelly Johnson and his team. Kelly likes silver airplanes, but Pete Law, his thermodynamicist who did that drawing for me, said, hey boss, if you paint the airplane black, it'll help you with a couple things. You'll see here in a minute, you saw in the video, the sky is black above us because 97% of the atmosphere is below us. The second thing, some of you have in your home or you've rented a cabin, if you have a potbelly stove, I'll bet you 99% of the time it's black, because black is the best radiating color. So if you paint this airplane black, I can reduce the temperature by over 50 degrees when you're traveling at 2,150 miles an hour, reduce the stress on the airplane. And so in that, we also put finite iron particulate matter, which helped diffuse the radar when it struck against the side of the airplane. Talked about the quartz glass. You had to preheat the engines to start them because at 32 degrees, the oil was a solid. So you had to make sure that the oil was above 70 degrees before you can even crank the engines. That is all, this is all the stealth material. You see all the edges that would reflect against the Russians or Chinese radars is protected so they don't get a good image coming back. Now, as per the Eisenhower policy, we never overflew Russia, but we flew as close as any U.S. airplane flew to them, and I'll talk later about the accuracy of our navigation system. This is on the surface that shows you as the radar hits the edges, it's actually captured and goes harmlessly into these traps along all those edges so it's not reflected back. It's a double delta. The forward part right here is America's first lifting body. When the airplane was in flight, think of the nose about 6 degrees up, and you're going so fast, you're compressing that very thin air like a boat compresses the water as it goes across. And look at it, it's the same shape as the space shuttle. Because a lot we learned from this airplane, they would later use in the development of the space shuttle that you can see out at the Uvar Center. We've already talked about the Sound of Freedom. We actually did that the 3 nights before invaded Panama. It was after my time, but they boomed Noriega in his house and said, you know, it's time to leave because the next night it's not going to be an SR arriving, it'll be the U.S. Marines. Everything on the airplane was recorded, 650 points, everything you said. Every time either one of us moved a switch, it was mostly for maintenance because the biggest problem solving on this airplane is sometimes the systems would break down when they were hot and you get them back on the ground and they're not hot and they work perfectly fine. So by looking at the recorder, they could better isolate, you know, what's happening at this time when the airplane is over 600 degrees that's causing whatever the malfunction. Also made check rides real easy because they just downloaded the recorder and said, okay, you did okay. And we still had check rides in the simulator to see how our emergency procedures were going, but a lot was checked this way. Those are good tires. They're good for 15 landings, 22 ply, 425 PSI, pounds per square inch of nitrogen. Because if you put air in there, as the tires heated up in flight, because they'd heat up over 500 degrees, the oxygen in the air would go into the rubber, and when you came back, you'd have, in our case, 6 main landing gear would be slightly flat. Of the 12 airplanes we lost, 4 of them were directly related to tire failure. So this was one of the critical elements on this airplane that we were very protective of. This is the assembly line down at Burbank, California. The airplanes were then partially disassembled. They were trucked up to Area 51, and that's where your testing took place. Later on, when the program was finally publicly announced, they didn't have to go up to Area 51 for the final testing and assembly. The airplane is anytime you have a stealthy airplane, it becomes unstable. With the SR-71, our first stealthy airplane, it's unstable in pitch, that's up and down, and yaw, sideways. So no matter how you're flying the airplane, this is a normal pedostatic. It's measuring how fast you're going. But this side probe, and you can see there's a hole on the top and the bottom and on either side. So as you're flying, hand flying the airplane, which you could, or with the autopilot, as the air goes over that side probe, it's talking to the air control computer and saying, okay, I'm in tolerance, or if I'm not in tolerance, it's putting very small inputs into the airplane to keep the airplane in a controlled environment. So it was, without that, the airplane was almost impossible to fly. How do you like that? I came to the program at RF-4s. This is a 50s, early 60s cockpit. Kelly Johnson said he had so many problems that he wasn't going to mess with the cockpit. Well, I had actually come back to Beale for the first time. I'll talk later on that. And they put me in the cockpit. I'd never seen it. And I'll tell you, I was sorely disappointed because I thought, here's this supersonic airplane that does all this stuff, and it's got the same cockpit I'm leaving, basically. All round dials, it's all analog. The one good thing, or there was a number of good things, but they filmed our mission and it went at our ground speed. So it would tell us as we're going along, a turn point coming up, what fuel we should have for our backseater, when cameras would come on, defensive systems, when they should come on, all the key things, divert bases if we'd already put them on there. And towards the end of I flew a test flight on it, but I never flew it in the airplane. Think of right across here. I'm sure everybody here has seen Star Wars. Flying this airplane at night, it could become very disorienting because of the sky is absolutely amazing with 90% of the stars you can't see down here on the ground because they're so faint. And then you get over remote areas of the United States and you wonder which way's up. So there was a Canadian dentist who patented a laser attitude. And imagine, instead of having to focus at night in this little gauge here to see if you're okay, you had a laser ray that went across the whole cockpit so you could actually use your peripheral vision. And myself and one of the other SR pilots flew 2 nights in an auxiliary airplane to see what we thought of it. I'm telling you, 5 minutes into flight, we loved it. And they eventually modified the whole fleet and made everything a lot safer because of it. This is a modern cockpit. Now, think about what you just saw. This is the F-35 cockpit that you've heard about. It's called HOTAS, hands-on, stick and throttle. The gamers are gonna love it. I saw a couple younger people back here. You've been doing it in your games. You got those consoles, you got all those buttons, you're using your feet, you're using your eyes, you're listening. The screen is 8 inches by 20 inches. You can have up to 12. For those of you that are pilots, how would you like to fly an airplane like this, and your only engine instrument that is, or your only engine indication that's normally up there is a green light? If the light turns amber, you better mine in and see what part of your system is not working, because you only have a single engine, so it's pretty critical. And this, imagine you're in an airplane, and this is your virtual reality, like you're reading about. You can look down, day or night. The outside of the airplane is covered with sensors, so in high definition infrared, it's like the airplane doesn't exist. You can see right through everything. It is truly amazing. This is what the backseater looked like. He had a much bigger display because he was doing the navigation and the cameras on and a lot of other things. So his map that they had a lot more detail on it than my map did. You know, for pilots, you keep it simple. Don't give us too much data because one, we won't read it, and two, we won't remember it. On the front of the airplane were 2 blisters. We never worried about somebody coming up behind us. You know, the road runner was not going to run us down. Any threat was going to come at us from the front. So these receivers were looking for air-to-air radars from fighters and surface-to-air radars from missile sites. Once you launched onto us, these jammers underneath would come into being, and that was the last time that fighter or that ground site could talk to their missile. We basically jammed the communication. So there were over 100 or so missiles fired at us. I never personally had a missile fired at me. The closest one that ever came to an airplane was about 1.5 miles behind the airplane. And back in the 70s when I flew these, there were only certain parts of the country we could turn this on because, remember, back then most people had TV antennas. And if you were watching whatever you were watching, and I flew over and my jammer was on, I wouldn't damage your television, but I'd take your picture away. And so the local sheriffs didn't like all those calls on why this community or that community all of a sudden had lost their... We could communicate at great distances. One of the biggest use of this was we would range on our tankers. When I say range, we could see where the tanker was and how far they were away beyond 300 miles. Because about 220 miles back, I've got to start down because I'm going from 2,100 miles an hour down to 325 miles an hour, or actually 450, 325 indicated, behind a tanker, because he's going as fast as he can go, and we're going as slow as we can go, particularly taking on fuel. Anytime there's kids in the museum, and I know Chuck's heard me say this, I always ask them, I said, have you seen Star Wars? And the kids, of course, they raise their hand. I said, well, you know, on the SR-71, this is R2-D2. And he sits right here. He can't walk, but he's got a magic eye, and it comes from the British. This is the first automated Star Tracker. I tell them today also that instead of an 800-pound computer, this would probably be 2 Apple Watches. Because think about it, this is the 60s and the 70s. Computers were pretty big because we really didn't have the capability. But they would tell this computer exactly where it was on the face of the earth. They'd load our whole mission, all the stuff that needed to be in there. We'd start the engine, we'd pull out of the hangar, and on a sunny day, within 30 seconds, a backseater would get a starlight. And we guaranteed the president 300 feet anywhere in the world, traveling at 2,200 miles an hour. So when we were doing particularly overflights, but any flight, an adversary could not pull us off our course by trying to send us a false signal because we're getting our information from above. And so there was no way that they could interfere with that process. That's 3,000 degrees. As I told you, the JP7 is a special fuel. It's very much like JP4, but it feels oilier, has about the same smell, but a much higher flash point. It will not start with an electric ignition. So you start it with a chemical ignition, and when this hits the air, it explodes at 3,000 degrees. So when you start the engine, it lights the fuel. Every time you light the afterburner, another shot of the TEB comes in there. And each engine had its own tank, and you were guaranteed 16 lights. So you got your first light to start the engine, and then the rest of them are for lighting the afterburner. Hopefully you don't have to relight the engine in flight. This is what it looks like. It's massive. Originally a Navy engine. It was too big for any of their uses. It's Pratt Whitney. The secret of, we talked about, are these tubes. There's 6 of them. The higher the speeds, this is the 4th stage of the compressor, too much air here, valves open up, the air bypasses the engine, and ends up in the front end of the afterburner in the back, because the afterburner needs more air for cooling, and also it adds to the thrust. It becomes like a ramjet. At 2,100 miles, at 3.2 Mach, 2,150 miles an hour, 83% of our thrust is ram thrust. It's the most efficient thrust you could have, and that's why the faster we went, the less fuel we burned. This is what it looked like. Imagine the core. That's 2,000 degrees right there. That's 3,400 degrees. You could feel the heat when you were out if you came out the trim pad at night. There were 13 joules here. That's fuel still slightly burning as it comes in the back. And the top temperature, like I said, is 3,400 degrees. And we ran these engines for an hour and a half to an hour 45 in afterburner. There's even no engine today that we have that can withstand. But there was a price to pay. Imagine in your car, be it GM or Chevrolet, that if you, every 400 hours that you ran your car around, you had to take it into the dealer and he had to give you a new engine. Or he'd tell you, if you can leave the car, we're going to send it back to the factory, and I think we can rework it and have it for you next week. That was one of the expenses of this program, was reworking the engines to keep them, because of the thermal stress they lived under. No engine, even today, can absorb supersonic air, so you have to adjust it down. All airplanes have different ways to doing it. And I'll show you, this is the subsonic position. This eventually will go back at 1,000 miles an hour, 1.6 Mach. You have to start slowing that air so it's not supersonic going into the engine. So this will start back, it'll more than double the opening, and it'll close down some in the back. So you see here, this is what it looks like subsonic up to 1.6 Mach. You can see the throat is open about this much, and here's the narrows. Now the next step, when we get to the full point, you can see it had doubled, more than doubled the opening, but it's also closed this down by over 50%. So you're manually compressing the air as it comes in here. And that's part of the secret of this whole ramjet effect. We're not going to worry about all these mice. Part of it is getting the airflow, the excess airflow around the engine back into the afterburner. There were 4 different sets of systems that we won't go into, but I in the front, some of them were automatic, some of them were manually controlled by the pilot. One step back. The one we were most concerned about was this one, because the other air stayed inside, went to the afterburner. This particular door system, which we had to keep modulating, it came out at 90 degrees and basically translated into drag. So we tried to keep that as low as possible. This is what, again, subsonically, actually not moving on the ground, and everything is open because the engine's not getting enough air. Now when you get up to the other way, everything is closed. When you're at the top speed of the airplane, almost all your other doors, other than that forward bypass, and again here, and you see at 80,000 feet, instead of 14.7 like we are right now, it's only 0.4. The air is really thin. 97% of the atmosphere is below you. And at the speed we're going and that opening, we're still capturing more than enough air to operate this airplane at that altitude. How do we get in the program? You had to be a volunteer. We didn't recruit. We recruited, talked to people if they might be interested, but they had to volunteer for the program. We needed over 2,000 hours. I was actually a little bit under that. 5 to 7 years of experience as a pilot or nav. You then had to submit to them your personnel record, your medical record, and your flight record. And they reviewed it, and then you hoped that they liked what they saw, because then they would call you back. Our home base was Beale Air Force Base in Northern California. It's about 45 miles north of Sacramento in the foothills. And you were there for a week. Your first 2 days was a modified astronaut's physical. You really learn about anything that you might be a little out of order. That's when I learned I really had flat feet. They said it wouldn't disqualify you for the program. And then for the pilots, we would fly them in the T-38 with a current SR pilot to see how did you fly airplanes, because we don't want somebody, this is a very low G airplane, 1.7 Gs at altitude at speed. We don't want a pilot that yanks the airplane around. And the last thing is we put the pilot in the simulators. It was the first computer simulator I'd ever seen. It was magnificent. It flew just like the airplane. But there was a trick to it, because I would take the candidate in there, and in the morning we would show all the controls, like you saw that wonderful cockpit with all the dials and switches and everything and circuit breakers, and we would go through it, get them to start the airplane, fly it around subsonically like an airplane that they were currently flying. And then I'd take them to lunch, much like happened to me when I was back there. And then after lunch, you bring them back and you say, okay, what do you remember? It was a learning test. How much did you recall from the morning? If you gave me a 40-mile stare, you kind of say, well, thank you very much, you know, for your time, and we'll return you back to your unit. We were just saying, you know, how much could you retain? Because we're going to spend a year training you to fly this airplane, because there's so many things that are very different about it. When I got through, went back to the base I was at, Kadena Air Base, Okinawa, Japan, and hoped that a slot for a pilot would come available, which it did 4 months later. This is December 1974, and unlike today, I got a telegram. That's how I learned that I was going to come into the program. This kind of shows you when we were home, in year training, once we were qualified, and when you're qualified, you had about 100 hours, and you'd have your first overseas tour in Okinawa, Japan, and that's where you'd fly your first operational missions. When you came back, you would fly the SR 3 times a month, typically 2.5, maybe 1 4.5 hour flight. That's 1 or 2 refuelings, and you'd have 1 simulator. The simulator was 4 hours long, and you spent almost all your time working on emergencies. They would throw everything at you and see how much do you retain. Every year we would lose a pilot or navigator. Generally in training, for the navigators, it was how to change their mind from 7 miles a minute to 35 miles a minute. Some people could not convert to that. Also, figuring out how to make the descent to get to the tanker. That was a critical part of the flight, and that was the tanker's role. The pilots, some pilots just couldn't adjust to the airplane. And we actually had pilots that left the program after they were, quote, fully qualified and had flown operational missions. Because when they came back and we put them in the simulator, they couldn't run the emergencies at the level that we expected, because when things happen in this airplane, you had only a few precious seconds to make sure you had done the right things, or you could lose the airplane. That was my crew picture, and one of the things I want to point out, this is the big Windows camera that takes that 72-mile wide picture that had the optical bar there. And this were just some of the events as you went through your first flight, your first Mach 3 flight. They came and the whole family was there, and they would pin a SR Titec kind of pin on you, and then you went through a series, and eventually worked up right before you went overseas. Was the first time we let you fly at night, because night could be very disorienting. So that was the last kind of achievement in the training order per se. And high banks were a challenge, because when you put this at 45 degrees of bank, that's 1.7 Gs. Most of the time you had to descend a little bit because you didn't have enough energy to keep it in that turn. And so it could be challenging. Particularly, I flew the first mission into West Germany. We were surveying the border along there, and we can't stay in Germany at 3.2 Mach, so we had to fly at 2.8 Mach. That's our slow speed, 1,800 miles an hour. And I've briefed some Germans on this. They get a big kick out of it. 1,800, that's your slow speed. I said, yeah, because I would swing around Munich kind of and do this routine. Same thing up in the Baltic. And we were very glad that the Swedes were always very generous, because we always overflew their outer islands because we couldn't turn tight enough up there, but they never complained. What about some of the special things in the program? Special survival. I'm here to tell you, I've been to water survival before in a regular Air Force type thing. And I see some U-2 pilots out here. I know they've been through this training. It's a whole different world in a spacesuit, because if that flotation doesn't work, you're a short-term aquarium, but you're looking from the wrong angle, because you're going to the bottom. There's no way you can keep yourself afloat. So there's a special program they put us through, and I'm here to tell you there were a lot of people around us when we went into the water to make sure that we didn't end up in the bottom of the ocean off the coast of Florida. Special intel. If you were here about 6 weeks ago, Gary Powers Jr. talked. He's written a book about the 80 letters or so that his father either wrote or received while he was at La Bianca prison. Gary Powers was singularly unprepared, as were the rest of the U-2 pilots at that time, for what would happen if you got shot down and were not killed. You now became a prisoner. What should you do? So there was a lot that changed because of the experience with Gary Powers, and also the experiences his wife had. Because they were CIA pilots, so it wasn't at an airbase somewhere where you had some kind of protection. But she was back in the hometown that she grew up with, and the press was on her doorstep, you know, at the speed of heat, asking all these questions and being the way they normally are. When you go through a special course, we still do that today to prepare, looking at covert ways of being able to communicate. You know, you've heard about the TAP code, you've heard about many other things. There were different ways to try to get information out, and one of the ones I can talk about is an example from the Vietnam War. One of the Navy pilots wrote his wife, and it was one of the letters that came out, and she took the letter to the Navy, to their intelligence, and she said, I don't understand this letter. And particularly this part right here. He talks about having this classic car, and I'm really concerned about it. And would you tell Uncle Richard, tell old Richard to use real enamel when he paints it again? Well, if you break it down, and this was only one of the samples from this letter, tell old Richard to use real enamel. Take the first letter, it's torture. And embedded in that letter were many other codes that we had a pretty good assessment on some of the things that were going, and it was the first indication that we knew from inside. And this is part of what that school is about. Yes, we're on U.S. hands, but we experienced some of the different. I've been waterboarded. I spent about 8 hours in a box. I've had pretty interesting interviews, sleep deprived to a certain point. But I knew where I was. I was in the United States. I didn't feel necessarily threatened. I was being given an experience. Hopefully I would never have to witness on the other side. But this is all part of this preparation that continues. When we came to Beale, the very day I reported in, the commander grabbed me and said, okay, I got 3 sets of keys. You're living on base. You have no choice. And there's a good reason for that, because you're going to be overseas, you're going to be flying special missions, and we want your families protected. So if anything happens to you, we can prevent anybody from coming on the base that we don't want here through whatever type of duration that might take place. My wife would later go to a one-day special course, give her a background on what to expect if something happened. You know, what would the Air Force do? What would be the role of the government? What were some of the protections, but, you know, for she and our daughters on the base to make sure that it took place. Typical 150 days a year overseas. There were typically 6-week tours to Japan. The tours to England were of varying length, and it was dependent on the operations. This was a picture taken. I was waiting for the code to come to launch on a Cuban overflight, and one of the other SR pilots took this picture, which is probably the best picture ever taken for me sitting in the cockpit. You kind of see the pilot flies the airplane. He's responsible for the mission. He's responsible for the fuel control and the running of the engines. Also, obviously picking divert bases, doing many other things. The navigator has a reconnaissance systems officer is his title. He's got the navigation, he runs the cameras, the defensive systems are in the back, When we're flying over the United States, it's the navigator who's normally talking. The pilot normally only talks in the traffic pattern when we take off and we come back into land. The rest of the time, it's our RSO that's doing the talking. These are Gemini suits. Each of us had 2 suits. One was chocolate brown. This was my favorite daytime suit. And we had a white suit. If our pictures were taken, the Air Force insisted, from a publicity perspective, we had to be in the white suits. The problem with the white suit, at 85,000 feet, you cannot believe how intense the sun is. So the light's coming in and reflecting off your white suit on all your instruments. And it really made it a lot more difficult. So nighttime it didn't matter, but daytime, if I came in to have a flight and it was my white suit down there, I knew what they were going to tell me, that the brown suit was in for some kind of maintenance and I couldn't use it. But if you did have to eject at 85,000 feet, and we did have a test pilot and a test engineer go out at 82,000 feet, full speed, you'd stay with the seat down to about 15,000 feet, take you 8 to 10 minutes. At that time, the seat would kick you out, a big parachute would open, and then you came down at about 1,000 feet per minute. Like I said, we never had an Air Force fatality. It was an absolutely amazing system. This was the new system. Initially, this was a secret operation, and many of you ladies use their other products. David Clark Company. They won the contract way back when, and they still build spacesuits today. They're the leading builder of it. Early on, they were, like I said, it was a classified project that most of the company members did not know about. Each suit weighs about costs about $250,000. Each of us had 2 suits. The suit weighs 45 pounds. The helmet weighs another 10 pounds. Every year we would suit up 10, 20 adults. If you're claustrophobic, this is not the program to be in. When we came to the time to put the helmet on, about 30-some% of the people said no, they'd seen enough, you know. Thank you for the orientation with the suit. The suit is 4 layers. One, when you come down, you put on cotton long johns because you're going to perspire. The layer that touches you is nylon for comfort. The next layer is rubber, because this suit has to inflate and give you an artificial environment if you lose cabin pressure or you had to eject. The next layer looks like a fishnet, because it's adjustable. The suits came in 12 sizes. The outer layer was made of a special material called Fipro. It's good to 800 degrees, so if you had to eject through a fireball, it would buy you some temporary protection. The wonderful thing we learned with the Mercury astronauts, if you make a form-fitting spacesuit, we Americans have some interesting holiday habits. As we come into this time of year, we need to tighten up our spacesuits because we're outside, we're losing a little weight, we're more active. And then you get to that great time of the year, Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's, and when you have a suit that's tailor-made, it gets awful tight. So, the fact, and also when you leave, are you going to have to hire somebody that looks exactly like you? Or we made that investment of all that money. So with the 12 sizes, we could adjust it to, and they could reuse the suit after we left the program. This is where the vent air comes in. You can control in flight, particularly in longer flights, you get places where you get hot spots, and what you do, you inflate the suit so you kind of look like the Pillsbury Doughboy, but then you can move your arms and move your butt around and kind of get the air where you want it. Right here, this is the helmet ring, but this is called the bow tie. And the first time we ever inflate you, we don't tell you about that. And what happens is that the suit inflates, it expands, and it tries to pull your head out of the helmet. Because the whole purpose of that, it's tied down to your crotch, and it makes sure this ring stays on your shoulder. So from that time on, I'm here to tell you, no pilot or navigator ever forgets, make sure he tightens the bow tie, because the last thing he wants is looking at the helmet like this going, okay, where is that thing that pulls the collar down? Your sense of feel is really restricted. You put on cotton surgical gloves. The gloves themselves then have rubber liner and leather. So imagine you're working, it's like taking your nice going to church or meeting gloves, take your kitchen dishwashing gloves, and then put on your gardening gloves. So in the cockpit, we tried to see as much as we could. Feel was kind of a sporty thing. And one of the things, particularly in the front cockpit, I had probably 50 or 60 circuit breakers I could not see. It was all by feel. So I kind of had to know, and the navigator could read out to me which row and how far out. So feeling was pretty important. The helmet, again, I said, there's 2 oxygen systems. It's so bright up there, during the day, you always had your sun visor down. On this side of the helmet over here, you had access port. And every flight, you carried water. Because you're breathing 100% oxygen, you're in a suit that's going to cause you to perspire some. A normal 2.5 to 4.5 hour flight, you're going to lose anywhere from 1 to 3 pounds. The most I ever lost on a flight was 7 pounds, but that was 9 hours and 45 minutes. So we carried water to try to keep as hydrated as possible. And if I was flying more than 5 hours, I also carried food, like the astronauts. It's called tube food. But this was early on, and we didn't have a great selection like they do today. It was, I accused them it was Gerber's Junior Foods. The sloppy joes and beef and gravy, I never developed a taste for. But I carried applesauce and peaches, butterscotch pudding, and vanilla pudding. Over at Andrews Air Force Base last spring, or maybe the spring before last, the U-2 came in, and they had their folks that worked the suits and all. And you should have seen the list of, you know, key lime pie, chicken parmesan, I mean, all kinds of things. I would have loved to have taken up with me sometime. I was just in the wrong age. Now, the helmet itself, the glass, has a fine gold film in it, because it's just like when you came here today, you may have had to turn on your car defog. Well, it was too hot, probably not. But in the winter, you know, if you're in the car and you're breathing, your exhale has moisture in it, and it descends on the glass. Same thing in this suit. It always have, you could feel it in your eyes, you could feel the heat, because that's the only way you keep the moisture off the glass in front of you. This is all we carried. We did not carry any other form of identification. We did carry 50 cents, so if we landed away, we could make a phone call. Go figure. Once you'd flown an operational mission, you could now wear this patch as a pilot or a navigator. We were the only ones. In the history of the program, only 85 pilots ever flew the airplane operationally, and about 85 navigators flew the airplane operationally. Anyone associated with the program, be they planners, be our tankers, be the people that work the sensors, you name any function you can think of, this is the patch they wore, which showed them they were part, identified them as part of the support structure that was so critical to making this airplane work. This was a map carried from the London to Los Angeles speed run. That was 3 hours and 47 minutes. The cockpit is really small. My wife was not allowed in the cockpit when we were at Beale Air Force Base. About 5 years ago, at a museum on the West Coast, they opened up the cockpit and let her get in. I was going to close the canopy on her. She didn't agree to that. But she looked up at me and says, you know, this thing is really small. And I looked at her, I said, you're in street clothes. Put yourself in a spacesuit. And there is no room. You know, you are literally, you'll see in a picture here in a few minutes, you're literally installed in the cockpit. This is the map that was carried on that speed run. The airplane at the Uberhazy set the speed run plus New York to London in an hour 55. And when that airplane came from Los Angeles, it was 64 minutes from overhead to Los Angeles. I mean, it was that speed, LAX, to overhead Dulles Airport. We used to set world records almost every day. One of the interesting things is last year we celebrated the 40th anniversary because it still holds the absolute manned speed record, 2,193 miles an hour. I was there when we set it, helped get the crew in the airplane. We thought it would last a year or two because they were spending a lot of speed record. We're now 41 years into it, and nobody has really come close to taking that record away from us. The mission. The day before, you'd go through a complete mission review with you had a whole computer section. Because imagine you don't go in and take maps out and start drawing it yourself. you're going at 35 miles a minute. So there's a computer, there's a whole group of trained men and women that do all the planning, but you go in to verify that everything looks right, per se. The critical checkpoints, where are the targets that you have to worry about the cameras? What's the fuel consumption? Any high bank turns that you might have to watch out for crossing borders you're not authorized to cross? Divert bases, defensive systems, and there were always special rules of engagement. That's ROEs. When you flew this airplane, just like the U-2 today, you're flying. How do you fly the airplane operationally? But oftentimes when you're flying it, you're given a whole other set of rules that are politically driven. And it may be for that day alone. I'll give you an example. When I flew out of Kadena on one particular flight up in the Sea of Oshkosh, you come over Japan, you got the Kamchatka Peninsula coming down. The mission was way up because we considered international water, make a turn up here, stimulate the Soviets, and come down. For some reason, we were not told. We were told under no circumstance is the SR-71 to land on Honshu, the main island of Japan, that day. To the point that the message was read to us, if you have to, you put it in the ocean if you could not get to Korea or if you cannot get back to the sun. And we sat there and went with my backseater. And that night we had a problem, but fortunately with the refueling, but we were able to get enough fuel to get home. But those are some of the things that sometimes would occur. There's no explanation to us, just these are rules that have been applied because something's going on politically in the background that they don't want an SR-71, which is considered a sensitive airplane. Training mission, we just go to, they were standard missions, we'd review them, we'd flown them many times, typically 1 or 2 refuelings, file base ops, come in, have our, you'll see here in a minute, that no one pop, but there's no big briefing about it. An operational mission, you had the overview with the commander. I mean, everybody's staff that needed to be there was there. You had the weather, what was the weather like? Were there going to be thunderstorms in the area? Was there going to be unusually warm temperatures? Other things that might affect the flight per se? What is the tanker status? You know, we fly at 2,100 miles an hour. Like when I flew in the Middle East for President Carter, we had to wait to get our tankers forward because they're not moving into Egypt at 2,100 miles an hour. They're moving in there at 520. And then they had to reconstitute themselves and get themselves in position to be able to refuel us as we came down there. Intelligence update, what's going on in the area you're in? Are there any special interest items? North Korea, what a great, you know, I've been studying them for 40 years. And they don't get any better, we keep hoping. The missile site that fired on an SR about 2 months after I left the program in August of '75 have been giving us trouble for, what I say, they've been playing with us actively, trying to make us bring our defensive systems up, trying to simulate like they were going to launch. So we had reported it many times. Well, finally in August, they did launch. They launched 2 missiles, but they weren't effective. Like I said, anything special politically that we had to consider. When we flew in the Middle East, John Murphy and I, it was the first time the British had ever allowed us to fly out of England into the Middle East and come back. They were always afraid of an oil embargo. France did not allow us to overfly, so I had to come down around Portugal and Spain and head on in, per se. That night, because of the sensitivity of it, the head of MI5 and MI6 were there because they were just kind of, this is the first time they'd ever approved, the government of Britain had ever approved something like this. Our deputy ambassador was there. And I asked him, with the conflict taking place on the peninsula, if I have a problem, where do you want me to go? And you should have seen this man. He turned absolutely white. And he said, problem. I said, I'm not afraid of the defenses, but you know, sometimes airplanes have mechanical problems. Where do you want me to go? And he looked at me and said, we have no idea. Pick a base. So my backseater and I picked a base way in the southern part of Egypt if we had to, because we figured it was far away from civilization if that happened. Fortunately, it did not. But that's the kind of thing you can come up with, or the conditions that might occur that you kind of had to think your way through it. The day of the flight, you come in 2 hours and a half early. You had a physical before every single flight, and you had to pass it. The most important part was your blood pressure, your heart rate. If your sinus had any problem at all, you did not fly. Some of my YouTube brethren here, their cockpit at that time was 28,000 feet, which would even be worse on your sinuses. Ours was 26,000 feet. So if you had any kind of a head cold type of thing, being in an airplane was not where you needed to be. About an hour, you had a high protein, low bulk, steak and eggs to give you the energy. Hour 15 prior, you'd come down. You can see I've got cotton long johns on, the perspiration I told you about. There's 2 technicians, one on either side of you. The suit is laying on the floor. You pull it on like a pair of overalls, coveralls. And then I've got the arms in, you see, and I'm just about, they're going to pick the suit up, and I'm just about ready to duck my head through there to get it into the ring, as you see here. And now they're going to start, the main seal on the suit starts down in your crotch in the back and comes all the way back up right behind your neck. And that's the biggest seal that seals the suit, the way you get in and that. So now he's going to go through and make the checks, put all that together before we then make the next step, which will be putting the helmet on. The helmet had an inner layer. We breathed 100% oxygen during a flight because we're afraid of the bends and we wanted to get the nitrogen out, then we wanted to stay at 26,000 feet. If we didn't have an enriched oxygen environment, we'd be suffering hypoxia all the time. So around your face, if you can imagine, you've got the helmet you see there, but you can see this inner seal. It's a face seal. It seals around your face, and this is all bathed in 100% oxygen. As you exhale, it comes down into the suit per se. The Soviets came up with a really fancy system. They cooled part of the suit using nitrogen, and they killed at least 1 or 2 of their astronauts because they got overpressurization, and the nitrogen came up in the face seal area, and they suffocated. So it was kind of critical that all the seals were properly. And now we're setting it up to do the checks to make sure the oxygen, the communication system, all the pressures, the glove, the face heat, again, as I told you about. This is what the kids loved. They inflated you. You look like the Pillsbury Doughboy. And inside that suit, it actually was kind of difficult to move because you're working against the pressure of the suit. Now, particularly the boys would like to come and beat on the suit because they thought it would be pretty spongy. It's not. It'll go in about maybe a 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch, but then your fist is going to bounce off because the pressurization is really pretty good. You held your breath. They checked for leaks. If everything was good, they then finished the suiting up process. Take you out to the airplane. There was always a backup crew. They would get in the cockpit in their normal Air Force attire, not a pressure suit, and they would put the switches exactly where you needed to start the engines. Because in the suit, again, you had limited visibility, and it just made it. You can see here, this was our replacement suit. This was the air conditioning was better. They replaced the Gemini suit. And down below, when the shuttle astronauts had to test Columbia, they didn't have any pressure suits. So they borrowed 6 or 8 SR suits. But I would tell you all, you need to feel sorry for those fine gentlemen. I mean, what a great opportunity to go into space. But you cannot get into the SR suit by yourself. So they had to spend 2 days in their suit. Because each one of the first 4 Columbia were test flights. The longest I was ever in the suit was 13 hours, and I was glad to give it back to them. I have over 1,000 hours total, but 13 was the longest I was ever in there. And would you believe it, the astronauts never gave us our suits back. You also notice, if you ever look at the history, shuttle flight 1 through 4, test flights. They wore spacesuits because they weren't sure exactly how the shuttle was going to work. Mission 5 through 24, they wore cotton flight suits. They had spacesuits if they're going to do a spacewalk or something up above, but they went up and down in normal suits. With the Challenger accident, there was an option possibly to have ejected, but at 100,000 feet, if you're not in a spacesuit, you are instantly dead. So if you'll notice, from mission 25 through 135, they had a spacesuit going up and a spacesuit coming down. So in case they lost pressurization or some other adverse thing took place, they had some options. This is the 22 December 1964, the first SR flight. It's kind of remarkable. Great test pilot, Bob Gilland. He took the airplane supersonic on its first flight. It helped in the fact that there had been a predecessor in the A-12, delayed a lot of the bases for it. This is installing, and you got a man or woman on either side, and they're using checklists, and you get in the cockpit, and you put your arms up on the rail, and you're watching them as they're connecting all the straps, the communication, the double oxygen, all the different things, your survival, your parachute, everything that has to be activated. Because the engines weigh so much, we couldn't use air carts back then. We tied together 2 Buick Wildcats with a drive, and it went up into the engine to turn it over. And every time they started these engines, it sounded like you were at a drag race, because those Buick Wildcat engines were running at max RPM to get that engine to turn over, to get enough torque out of it. And occasionally they would throw a piston or they'd catch fire, but again, there was no fire hazard associated with the SR fuel, the JP7. It had to be lit in a certain way, otherwise it wouldn't light. You've heard the rumor that the airplane leaked fuel? Oh, it leaked fuel everywhere. And the reason for that, think about it, the airplane is 600 degrees average. You can't use rubber liners to keep your fuel in the airplane. So they sealed the tanks as best they could with silicone, but the silicone was becoming brittle with heating, and so it was very common to have multiple pans underneath the airplane collecting the fuel you see laying on the hangar there. But there was no fire hazard. One of the hazards, about every 2 months we had to give our maintenance people that worked in the hangars new boots, because the fuel did attack the rubber soles. My wife was around the airplane, so longer story again, before I was, and she came back and she said, pull that volunteer statement, it's the most dangerous airplane I've ever seen. They're wearing raincoats. And they did. As the airplanes approached 100 hours before they go into fuel reservicing, some of them just, fuel would rain out of almost everywhere. But again, there was no fire hazard. There was a slippery hazard of falling and busting your... You can see the profile coming out. The engines represent the biggest cross-section area on the airplane. Your greatest sense of speed was on takeoff. You're cleared to take off. You light the 2 afterburners. Think about a drag race. Within 20 seconds, you're going to go from 0 to 240 miles an hour. You'll have gone 4,500 feet, and you're now lifting off, and you're going to go through 20,000 feet less than 2 minutes from the time that you lit those afterburners. If you go all the way to 80,000 feet, it's going to take you another 17 minutes, and you're going to go 360 miles. But think about it. You're going from 20,000 feet at about 400 miles an hour, 400 indicate. You're going to climb 60,000 feet. You're going to level off doing 2,150 miles an hour, and you're going to burn a third of your fuel. But you're climbing and accelerating at the same time. There's really no other airplane out there that was capable of doing that. See, if we overflew hostile areas, we had to be at 3.15 Mach above 75,000 feet. That was the restriction. The biggest problem there came with Cuba, because the warm air down there and where our refueling was off the Texas coast, sometimes it didn't give us a long run to get up to altitude. Fortunately, their defenses weren't that significant. This is what it looks like. Almost 350 miles in any direction. Curvature of the Earth. This is starry at night. 90% of the stars we can't see down here. If you know Lake Tahoe, that's what it looks like from a U-2 at 70,000 feet. You can see when you're looking down from 14 miles up, those 10,000-foot mountains right here take on a different perspective. They're just not as impressive. Multiple types of sensors. This airplane was really well designed for optical. Imagine if it was a sunny day out there today and I flew over and we assembled you all out there. I'm at 85,000 feet, I'm doing 35 miles a minute. I'm 16 miles above you, and I take your pictures. I will see all of you. And in the 70s, I could tell you about 70 to 80% of the time what kind of car you were driving. That was the accuracy of our cameras. Again, that's why 6 presidents. I can't recognize your faces. The best I can do is kind of sort out adults, males and females. Kids are a problem, because if they're real small, you can kind of say, yeah, that's a kid. But those middle-sized ones, you don't know if it's a big teen or a small adult. So, but you can see the quality of what was the photography, and the U-2 is in the same category. Absolutely spectacular photo capability. With that also, the big country's camera. We looked basically 36 miles either side of us, 72. You could film 100,000 square miles in an hour. We also had a radar. The radar could look out with 1-foot resolution about 80 miles either side of the airplane. And you could do a strip even further out. Electronically, if you came up on a radar or a transmitter, I could see you over 300 miles away because I was up so high, we could see. At that time, we were probably the greatest electronic surveillance collector that they had. This kind of gives you an idea. There's that 72-mile wide. These are the cameras on either side that saw you in the parking lot. These are the radar SWAT. This is the electronic collection per se. One of the comments down here, people often ask me, what were your toughest missions? And people normally think it's when you're overflying an adversary. You may get shot at. That's true. But the other side of it is, if there's any political risk, it's been assumed by whoever approved it, National Security Council, or in the case I flew in the Middle East, by President Carter himself. They put you, our navigation system was good within 300 feet. They put us 400 feet from the boundary. You were not, I had a major emergency on the North Korean border. To have saved the airplane, I was in a turn. I really needed to roll it out and stabilize it. But if I'd rolled it out and stabilized it, I would have overflown North Korea, which would have been a political violation. So I had to nurse it around, and in the process of nursing it around, the airplane was damaged. It was recoverable. I recovered it at an air base in South Korea, but a maintenance team had to come up and do some interim repairs so I could fly it subsonically back to Okinawa to have more extensive repairs done on it. Coming down, about 220 miles back, 10 minutes before you're going to hook up with your tankers, you very carefully come out of afterburner and you start a very controlled descent. The air refueling receptacle, you can see, you'll see the picture is fairly well back. They transfer fuel at 1,000 gallons a minute. The airplane holds 12,400 gallons. A typical refueling would be 12 to 15 minutes, and we take on anywhere from 11 to 13,000 gallons of fuel. This is what we look like. I never refueled from a KC-10. That's a bigger tanker. The these 135s were the special centerline tank that carried our special fuel, were the ones that took us around. And we refueled on practically every flight. It was part of the heart and soul of the airplane. Multiple tankers, because some places we put the tankers, it took them a long time to get there, and we're always afraid if you had only one tanker, what if it didn't work and you're flying an operational mission? I'll give you this picture kind of represents the extreme. Sacramento, California, Beale Air Force Base. I take off at 10 o'clock at night on a Friday. I refuel over Idaho, Montana, 3 tankers, supersonically across Canada. 3 tankers come up from Goose Bay, refuel me. I cross the Atlantic as the sun's coming up. 3 tankers out of England, refuel me well north of the Arctic Circle. I will then go along the north coast of Russia and look for submarines, because I can look in 100 miles and survey their subpens. I'll come back around. There's 3 more tankers that came out of England. They'll refuel me. I come back supersonically across the Atlantic. The 3 tankers that refueled me in the morning have refueled on the ground. They're back up in the air. They refuel me again. And I cruise back to California. I land at 8:20 in the morning with my 3 daughters in the wing commander's car ahead of me. So I went over 15,000 miles. I took fuel from 15 different airplanes, and I consumed over 72,000 gallons of fuel. So you can see the integral relationship between the tankers and the SR-71s. This is what it looked like coming in. This happened to be a KC-10. At night, this was particularly important. This would tell you to go forward or aft or up or down. There's green lights right in the middle that tells you that's exactly where that boom operator, he or she, wants you to fly the pipe down. Here's a refueling taking place. And Lockheed said that when we flew, the leaks went away. Well, I think this is proof that no, the leaks didn't go away. There's just nobody there to record it. But again, there was no fire hazard associated with it. I'm actually refueling. It's me refueling. That's the head of our standardization. And he said, "What the heck are you doing up there, Buzz?" I said, "Well, I told him I'll buy him some beers if he lets me try this." It wasn't bad in nice weather off of Japan. I can't imagine that job responsibility in turbulence at night in the weather, trying to hook up with us as we're coming in and telling them we need gas, now. This is the trainer, but you can see all the leaks. And we had 2 of these airplanes, but see, as an instructor pilot, that's why I sat in the back. This is the only airplane, this is its sister, that had flight controls in the back seat. If the pilot became incapacitated, there was nothing that the navigator, the RSO, could do in the back seat other than try to wake him up or say, don't, come on, feel better. Because their only option at that point would be to eject. And fortunately, that never occurred. There was one close call, but the backseater was real quick, and he realized that the pilot was suffering from hypoxia because he hadn't gotten his face plate down quite completely, so he was slowly passing out, and he kind of yelled some commands at him, and instinctively the pilot reacted to him, and it caused him. These are the bases we flew out of. Beale, that's where our home. We did our training there, but we did Cuba every 45 days, Nicaragua. USSR across the coast when we used their eastern coast. When we rotate airplanes to Japan, we'd go down the east coast to Kamchatka Peninsula. One little story on Cuba. President Carter was really an interesting individual. I was at Beale. This was just before I got to Beale. President Carter felt that overflying other countries was not ethical. So President Ford ordered the SR to fly over Cuba one last time. And the wing commander at Beale had to call back to Washington, D.C. because the SR landed 10 minutes before President Carter took his oath of office. 2 years we did not overfly anyone. And our president was kind of handed his proverbial, and then we started overflying a lot of places. And we kind of sometimes scratched our heads of, why are we doing this? But that was the nature of President Carter and his learning curve. Kadena was our far west location. These are all the different ones served. Mildenhall became our European operation. Eielson was not used when I was in the program. Seymour Johnson, this was absolutely critical. 1973 war, the satellites were in the wrong position. SRs flew from the east coast of the United States, initially New York, but then mostly from North Carolina, because none of the European countries would let us fly because they were afraid of an oil embargo. And the photography brought back by the SR was exclusively used by the president because he wasn't getting photography from any other source at that point. Diego Garcia, there's only 2 of us that have ever been to that wonderful island in the middle of nowhere. Your closest base is about 800 and some miles, and it's really not a base, it's an abandoned island that has a World War II airfield on it, but hasn't been used probably in a long time. I'll tell you a quick story on that. It's south of the equator. The star catalog that navigated this airplane, there were two of them. The northern stars, 61, and the southern stars. But if you look at it, we rarely have any conflict south of the equator. So in this particular flight, we came out of Okinawa to exercise. We were going to go into the Middle East coming from a different direction. Went through Thailand. As we crossed into the top of the Indian Ocean, all of a sudden the navigation stops. And I asked my backseater, so what's going on? He said, I don't know. I lost the starlight. When we landed, dead reckoning. You know, I figured it's 850 miles ahead. I hope we found it because fortunately the inertial was close enough, and then we could pick up the TACAN. But we landed, and as soon as we mentioned, we knew what the problem was. They forgot it was south of the equator. So once we crossed the equator, there was the stars. It didn't register any of the stars. They needed the Southern Star catalog. But what'll really get you is 2 days later, these same sheepish tech reps go, we have a solution, we think. We think if you take off and head to the northeast about 800 miles, you'll recognize the northern stars again, because we don't have the Southern Star catalog. So for the first 800 plus miles, we didn't have the normal navigation depending on it. This kind of gives you an idea of a typical South Vietnam mission. Coming out of Okinawa, refueling, swinging down, up over Hanoi, along the border, down in the Gulf of Siam, refuel, back up, 5,600 nautical miles, which is about 6,200 miles, 6,200 miles, 2 refuelings, 4.5 hours. They did that on a very regular basis. This is the Giant Reach. This is the 73 war. 5 to 6 tankers coming out of the United States. Our tankers were in Spain. They came out of Turkey too, I think. But anyway, they come into the Middle East, and then come back. Kodak picked up the film. It was processed as quickly as possible, delivered to Washington, and then delivered to the president. You came into land. Your approach speed is 195 miles an hour. You touch down doing 175. And you can see as soon as you touch down, your mains, you pull this, and it's like a big hand reaching out of the sky and brings you to, without this, it takes 10,000 feet to get this aircraft stopped. With the drag chute, we came to stop in 4,000 to 5,000 feet. So the drag chute was a great assist because the brakes were undersized for the airplane. As soon as we pulled in, they put fans on the brakes because the brakes were always overheated, again because they were undersized. This is how the sensor would come out of the shop beginning the flight. This is a full sensor. The glass window is full of the film. This is the side. It's got about 1,300 feet of film on it. It's winched up into the bay. They hook up all the connectors. Mission's over with. They lower it back onto the dolly. The dolly is wheeled into the photo lab, and they start the processing at that point. Like I said, it was well designed for the flexibility on the sensors. In the darkroom, you're going to cut the film into 500-foot lengths using, and you got cotton surgical gloves on, and then you're going to put the headers and the tails and put it in for processing. Because they want to make sure there's no tears or anything. If you've collected those valuable pictures, you don't want to lose it in the processor because something had a nick in it. I wish I had original pictures for you because you could see the stripes in the parking lot. 3 to 4 inches is probably the best you'd ever get. I know one of the test flights, they actually could see golf balls on the green because everything was absolutely perfect, but that was exceeded any kind of normal expectations. But the photography was pretty amazing. Color photography we rarely used. It was expensive. Took a lot to process. Best use was for camouflage, because with black and white film, you can't see really camouflage. Color film, if you can imagine, if you're trying to camouflage something and you cut a branch of a tree, the moment you cut that branch of the tree, it now reflects light in a different frequency. So by using color filters and color film, we could detect where camouflage was being placed that you wouldn't see with black and white film. That's its greatest use. This is the patch of the wing. KC-135, when I was there, SR-71s. Today, it's U-2s and Global Hawks. This is the home of high-altitude reconnaissance for the Air Force. The first squadron, which was the SR Squadron, is the oldest military aviation squadron in the United States. It was formed in 1913. It's been continuous. It is now a U-2 training squadron at Beale Air Force Base. This is the last picture ever taken. These airplanes were actually assembled here in the fall. I was in Germany at this time, thank goodness. There were 10 operational airplanes. And the one in the back, it's hard to see, but it's got an elevated canopy. That's our trainer. Why was the airplane retired? We spent $1 billion in the 80s modernizing these airplanes, taking it from an analog system to a digital system. The airplane was probably in its finest condition. There were no competitors out there that could really threaten it. But the Cold War had come to an end, and we decided policy, we weren't going to be overflying countries like this, because that mean old Soviet Union was going away, and Red China wasn't that big a threat. It was costing $85,000 an hour to operate because of all the tanker support, all the special maintenance, everything else. But the reason that isn't often talked about, but when I have particularly high school kids that I bring up, I said, I bet every single one of you has got a Samsung, an iPhone, or something. Because when I flew that mission for the President Carter, when we landed back in England, they downloaded the cameras and the sensors. He personally monitored our flight into the Middle East. They put it on a waiting airplane, flew it across the Atlantic to Washington, D.C. here, processed what we'd collected, then delivered it to the President. I'm guessing 24, 30, 36 hours. We don't live in that world today. My wife and I were recently in Australia. She always wanted to hold a koala bear, and she did. So I took a picture of her holding a koala bear. I clipped it, attached it to an email, and sent it to our 3 daughters, half the world away, in a minute. That's the world we live in. This airplane never developed a data link. Because the nature of the supersonic flight, they couldn't overcome some of the physics associated with the airplane. And I think that's really probably the biggest reason that the airplane was retired. Why don't we show that quick letter to Kelly, and then I'll take questions at that point. Kelly won the top award for aviation. They had advanced Alzheimer's. They made this film for its acceptance in 1990.
Dear Kelly, you and I have never met. I'm not a former SR-71 pilot or RSO. I wasn't a member of your design team at the Lockheed Skunk Works or on the assembly line that built the Blackbird. Nor was I a member of the Air Force at Beale, Milden Hall, or Kadena, who kept the Blackbirds flying. I'm not even an airplane buff in the classic sense. I'm just a person that had the privilege of being around your SR-71 Blackbird, and it was an experience I will remember intensely for the rest of my life. There's just something about your Blackbird, Kelly, that words don't adequately describe. Anyone who has been near a Blackbird and felt its presence knows what I'm talking about. It's a feeling in your gut, and instantly you want to be part of it. Part of what I call the Blackbird family. Today, Kelly, you are being honored for your design work on the SR-71, and justly so. To me, the SR-71 is not only your greatest aircraft design, it is perhaps the greatest aircraft ever built. I've heard it said that you considered the Blackbird the most fascinating challenge of your career. No wonder. It was a design that was so advanced that everything that touched it had to be new. New manufacturing processes, new tools, new materials, a whole new approach. You built an operational stealth aircraft a decade before most of the world had even heard the term. It was a design so far ahead of its time that it retired before time could catch up with it. In times of crisis, the Blackbird provided 6 presidents with a unique and critical view of the world. The Blackbird served this country for just over a quarter of a century. and that entire time it stood in a class of one. To me, the Blackbird is much more than a technical marvel. It's an airplane that gets inside you, an aircraft that causes the adrenaline to flow just by looking at it. Kelly, your Blackbird is the stuff dreams are made of. It's the model plane sitting in a young child's room, proof that everything is possible, that the sky isn't the limit. And it's the poster hanging on the office wall of a middle-aged engineer, testimony that yes, even in the real world, miracles do occur. The SR-71 embodies all that excites people about aerospace. Its crew seems part pilot, part astronaut. The Blackbird itself appears part airplane, part spacecraft. The typical Blackbird fan is a cross-section of America. It's your grandfather, your niece, your son. It's the wide-eyed young kid that buys an aircraft book at the National Air and Space Museum. It's the family that traveled hundreds of miles to an air show just to see a Blackbird in person. It's the people on the Air Force Base that stopped what they were doing to watch an SR take off. Everyone, every time, no matter how many times they'd seen it before. And it's the pilot who last flew the Blackbird 20 years ago, who has the look in his eye that says, I flew the best aircraft ever made. The look that can barely contain the desire to get in an SR just one more time and light the burners. When Blackbird 972 made its final record-setting flight to Dulles Airport, I watched the television with mixed emotions. This was the Blackbird's final flight. An aircraft that was the very definition of speed and power, but flying alone. But my sadness was tempered by the knowledge that this plane would now truly belong to the nation, coming to rest in the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. Now millions would be able to do what I had done, be near a Blackbird, be part of the family. Kelly, in the years to come, whenever I want to experience your airplane's majesty, I will remember the time I spent with your Blackbird, the smell of JP7 fuel, the feel of it on the soles of my shoes, the sound of an air starter wind up, the TEV ignite, and I'll put on the film that we shot during those incredible weeks in 1987. I'll watch it, feel it, be part of it again. Because in movies, Kelly, like in our memories, your Blackbird will fly forever. Congratulations, Kelly, and thank you. Devin Hawker, Assistant Cameraman, Blackbird, the movie.
Kelly only flew in the airplane once, and it was the A-12 trainer, and it was before the advanced engines were ready. The engines were the toughest part of the development process. So Kelly went 2.2 Mach in the, like I said, A-12 trainer, but that's the only time he ever was in the Blackbird. He was around it a lot. If you ever got a note when you came back from a flight that said, Kelly needs to talk to you, you needed no permission. He was clear for everything we did. You called down to Burbank, and I think his secretary's name was Mary Ellen, and she would give you a time and a phone number, classified, to call the boss. And when I came back from Europe after the flight in the Middle East for President Carter, there were a couple of anomalies on that flight. He wanted to know about them, because we hadn't been in the Middle East since 1973. This was March of '79. And I think it was the last flight out of England that far into the Middle East. There were flights into Libya after the raids that President Reagan ordered, both the pre-strikes and the post-strikes on that. So I will entertain questions at this time to see what's your interest. Right here.
Can you explain the patch?
Can we use the mic?
The Habu patch. Yes, I probably should have.
Buzz, can we use the mic, please?
Oh,
We'll try this.
use the mic for the question, but.
Yes.
Use the mic.
Yeah, you can use that.
I'll repeat this one. The Habu test, you saw the snake. The Air Force never named this airplane. And when it came to Okinawa, when it takes off, you think about a cobra, and they have a very poisonous snake on Okinawa called the Habu. And so as the SR takes off, it takes off with a very nose-high attitude, and to the Okinawans it looked like a cobra. So they caught, and it's black, you know, it's kind of sinister looking. So the Okinawan starts saying, oh, Habu, that's a Habu airplane. And so it stuck, and they adopted that the Habu would be our recognition that you'd flown an operational mission. But that's the background. Air Force never opposed it. They opposed some other things. Originally, every single one of the tails of the airplanes had different stencils on them. And the wing made a very tactical mistake for the change of command of the Chief of Staff, I want to say 1972, 73. Flew from the West Coast, came over Andrews Air Force Base to salute the new chief, flying, I think it's tail number 968, had the Playboy bunny on the tail. Before that airplane made it back to the West Coast, the orders were clear. Clean the tails up. Go ahead.
Yeah, anybody else?
What is the stall speed of the aircraft at 85,000 feet?
We would not approach it because the airplane would pitch up and break apart. We weren't even allowed to practice subsonic stalls in the airplane. We felt we had a pretty good margin, a larger margin than the U-2 did. Our indicated airspeed at Mach 3.2 was about 330. Stall speed was probably somewhere, I'm guessing, 270, somewhere down there. Like I said, we were not allowed. And if you put a strong input into the airplane, there was a pusher in it. It would literally take the stick out of your hand and shove it forward. So if you started yanking and banking this thing, it would reward you negatively for that.
Did you typically fly this by hand, or were you reliant on the computers that you had then for autopilots to take care of most of the mission?
You took off and landed, you hand flew it somewhere out in the, I think I mostly hand flew it up to maybe until I engaged it was 450 was our climb speed. When I was an instructor pilot, on your fourth mission, which was 4.5 hours, because your next mission was going to be your check ride, your initial check ride, I made you hand fly the airplane for 2.5 hours to demonstrate to me, one, you weren't afraid of the airplane and you could control the airplane through all phases of flight. So sometime in the future, if you lost your autopilot, you know, you could safely bring the airplane back. Your first mission in the airplane was subsonic. We took off, we went up to the tanker, we spent an hour and a half teaching you how to refuel. And then we brought you back into the traffic pattern, because think about it, you come in, you're very nose highs, no flaps on the airplane. So you think you're 70 feet forward of the main landing gear, and the first time a pilot, because the simulator had no visual, first time you're thinking you're still way in the air when your main gears are touching the runway. So it was to give them that sight picture that you're going to be feeling like you're still pretty high in the air when this airplane is in fact touching down, and you need to get the drag chute out, get the thing stopped if you're in fact at full stop. Don't be shy.
Well, so the Q models burn the JP7 or they have burn JP4?
Good question. My wife went up in a Q model one time, was supposed to watch me refuel, and guess what? Her husband didn't make it. The Q models could burn the fuel en route, but they couldn't use it on takeoff, and they couldn't use it when they were coming back to land, because if their engine had quit at that point, and they had 7 in the engine, even with the engine hot, the electric ignition would not light it. So if we didn't make it, they typically would go out and fly some kind of a nav route.
What was the...
Press it until it goes red.
What was the most challenging emergency procedure that you guys had to prepare for?
Probably the most challenging The beauty of this airplane, and one of the things the Russians really want to understand, is how could we go faster and burn less fuel, and why didn't we burn up our crews? And fuel was used as a coolant through a very exotic heat exchanger. But you saw the inlet. If all of a sudden the air got disturbed on one side, you got one engine that's producing 100% thrust. The other engine is producing, the engine's still running, but it's only effectively running at about 20 to 25%. The airplane starts a violent yaw, and it can pitch up on you. And it's so badly, I broke a sun visor on my spacesuit on one flight because I had had a whole series of unstarts in a row, and all of a sudden the other inlet decided it didn't like what was going on and hit me with the side of the cockpit per se. You literally had seconds because you needed, there was an auto clearing system, but it didn't always work. And the more of those unstarts you had, the more the airplane got twisted, the more likelihood you were going to lose hydraulics. It just was, you know, like most aircraft accidents, not a single event, it's a series of things that set you up. We worked under special rules. If you're a normal Air Force pilot, if an airfield was below minimums because of weather, you had to go to a divert base. In the SR-71, we were authorized to shoot an approach, and if we felt we could land safely, we were cleared to land. I landed one time in England at Mildenhall Air Base, and the airfield was closed. And control forgot to tell the tower I was coming in. Fortunately, there's nobody else there. When we called the tower and said, I mean, it was pea soup fog. I couldn't find the taxiway. And the tower said, well, where are you? I said, I'm on your runway. He said, no, you can't be on our runway. We're closed. No, I'm on your runway. It's a black airplane at night. Don't run into me. I need to get back to my parking. There could be some pretty hairy, but we worked under some pretty interesting rules, and I would say for the most part, our pilots were very proficient in dealing with circumstances like that.
Buzz, let me drop one in here quickly. You mentioned an unstart. Could you describe an unstart to the audience and tell them under what circumstances this would likely happen?
Unstart again. To reduce the drag on the airplane, the shock wave was carried inside that inlet you saw. So what happens with an unstart, there's some kind of disturbance. It could be the airplane in a bank and all of a sudden it's blanking that lower engine. It could be a change in air temperature rapidly that the airplane doesn't like, the inlet doesn't like. It spits that shock out. So now the inlet, which was producing ram thrust, is unstarted. The other side is still started and it's still producing the full thrust. And so you have to go through a process to go back out, capture the shock again, bring it back in and try to get it back inside the inlet to restart the engine. I had about 100 unstarts during the time I flew the airplane. The earlier guys had a lot more, and I had quite a few because I used to fly airplanes coming out of maintenance, and sometimes there were things that weren't just quite set right. After I left, they went from an analog system to a digital system. Once they went to a digital control system, they rarely had unstarts because the digital system could react so much quicker to changes that it was sensing outside than that analog system could. When we had a student in training, typically on the second flight, the IP would induce an unstart to make sure that they had experience with an instructor on board. And we do it where it was most violent, and that was between 2.6 and 2.7 Mach. The airplane seemed to react more vigorously there than at other speeds.
Thanks. Buzz, when you were in training, did you guys do touch and goes in a pattern?
We shoot touch and goes. When I was in training with an instructor pilot, on the trainer we could shoot touch and goes. Once we were flying by ourselves but still in a student status, we did not shoot touch and goes. We would periodically go back into the trainer for kind of upgrades for something, and at that point, the only people that could shoot touch and goes in the airplane, the ones you normally see, were the instructor pilots. And we only did it, we had to have a landing, touch and go landing every 45 days to remain current. And so I remember once or twice I was overseas, no trainer. So when I came back from a mission, I just shot a touch and go, came back around and landed, so I had my currency back. You're coming.
What was your most anxious mission?
He's right there.
Yeah.
Right there.
What was your most anxious mission?
Probably for President Carter in the Middle East, when you know the president is monitoring what you're doing, I mean, personally getting updates. And we went over there. It was the first time, like I said, the Brits had ever allowed us to fly out of England. We went to take off the first night. It was 4 in the morning, about ready to start engines. And weather folks, dust storms or sandstorms in the Middle East. So the mission has slipped 24 hours. Second night, mission slipped 24 hours, dust storms again. So we know, and Washington's getting antsy of when you're gonna, our tankers are now where they're supposed to be, and they're waiting. And because in many cases our tankers are airborne, when we are boarding on the ground, and they have to fly around for a while, come back, reconfigure for the next 24-hour slip. It was probably the most. I wasn't concerned about the defenses per se. I was just concerned that in fact we were able to execute the mission the way the President and the National Security Council wanted it. Originally, it was 3 missions, and we collected all the targets they wanted in that first mission, so there wasn't any follow-on mission, which led to an interesting, I'll give you just 2 little vignettes. One, we were a junior crew. The head of Standard Out, that's our most senior pilot instructor, and his backseater didn't like long flights. It was 9 hours and 45 minutes. So he came to me and says, Buzz, I got a deal for you. Rich Graham, who's written 5 books now, and still accuses me that I tricked him. I'll bring the airplane from California to England. That's a 4-hour flight, easy. You fly the first mission, 9 hours and 45 minutes. I'll fly the second mission. You fly the third mission, and I'll take the airplane home, and we'll have about the same amount of flying time. Well, there's only one mission. So the senior crew brings the airplane over for the presidential flight, and the senior crew takes the airplane back for the presidential flight. So I'm still accused that I tricked him to be the one that actually flew it. There is a funny circumstance that took place. This was a quick reaction mission. When you flew your first crew Mach-free flight, you had to throw a party for the squadron. So Saturday night, we're all having a party, and all of a sudden, the colonel who's in charge of operations grabs me about 9 o'clock at night and says, get your backseater, come down to the vault after church tomorrow. I get a call at 6 in the morning, says, get your backseater down here right now. So we come up in the vault, and they roll the map out, and I see the Middle East, and I see the problem, and he says, you're leaving in a couple hours. Because we're going to go over on the tanker force to meet the inbound tanker, or the inbound SR when it arrives there. So the colonel is trying to find me. This is before, cell phones and a lot of other stuff. So he calls the house, and I think it's our middle daughter, about 7 years old. She answers the phone, and Colonel Watson goes, do you know is your father home? No, my father's not home. Do you know where he is? No, I don't know where he is. Can you take a message? No, I can't take a message. So he asked her one more time, are you sure you don't know where your father is? I stopped the vignette right there. Let's fast forward. We're 3 nights later, 2 in the morning, England. As I told you, the deputy ambassador, the 2-star head of Strategic Command's operation, the head of MI5, MI6, some of the leaders in the Royal Air Force, others are in the room because it's the first time this has ever taken place. We get through the briefing, and one of the heads of MI5 or MI6 says, what does your family know about this? And I said, it's really low-key. We do not talk about missions. We keep it low-key. They kind of know I go east and west, but I fly airplanes. And John didn't have any kids, so it was kind of the same thing. All of a sudden, the colonel goes, well, not so fast, Buzz. I called your daughter trying to find you before we left Northern California. And I said, well, I hope she said this is the carpenter, Major Carpenter. Yes, she did. But then I asked her if she could take a message, and she said, I can't. I asked her one more time, do you know where your father is? in a whispery voice, she said, "I think he's out spying." I looked at my backseater and I said, "John, we're compromised. This may be our last flight."
Would the airplane fly on a single engine?
Yes, it would. Matter of fact, we practiced not with the engine off, but we had to shoot once a year proficiency to demonstrate that we could land the airplane on a single engine. Basically, quote, the bad engine was in idle. It wasn't fully shut down. We didn't do that. But yes, the airplane could not fly supersonically. It could fly, depending on the fuel load, probably 12,000 feet. We had one that lost an engine up over the Baltic, and coming back, it basically, to get back to northern Germany, it was around 12,000 feet.
Is it normal V1, V2 takeoff speeds?
Pretty much so. It happened very quickly. I mean, from brake release to you're off is 20 seconds. And basically, you had about 5 to 7 seconds initially before it really started accelerating to check, did everything look right. It was a really quick check. Because that was the time that you were going to have to stop. Because once you got to a certain point, you were going to go. Because it was just too hard to get that airplane to stop. Back here.
Yes, I have two questions. First one is, do you know how many G's you normally pull on takeoff?
It was probably like a nice, not like roller coasters now. That's a little more. It's probably 2.5, because it pushed you against the seat. You definitely felt the push of the airplane against it. The most G's we could pull on a cold airplane before we accelerated and heated it was 3.3 G's. This was a low G airplane. So on takeoff, yes, you felt the push, but it wasn't, wasn't super strong against you.
And then I had a question about the star tracker. I assume those work.
Excuse me, I missed the last part of it.
Did the star tracker work even when the sun was out, even in the daytime?
Oh, yeah.
Did it matter what altitude you were at?
That's an excellent question. I should have covered that. This came from Britain. It had some kind of a radioactive head, well beyond my brain level to explain it to you. But on a sunny day, it looked through the blue sky and locked on the stars. The sky was not there. The only thing that would cause problems, if you had clouds, it obscured its vision. And that star tracker today is used on your stealth bombers as one of their navigation systems. But it's a great system. We rarely had a failure on that particular tracking and navigation system.
Can you say anything about the YF-12?
The YF-12, great airplane. It actually knocked down targets over 100 miles away. But here's the problem. It was supposed to go against the advanced Soviet bombers. Once you put a person in a spacesuit, you better hit the time clock, because you start dehydrating, even with the best ventilation. So the concept of, Air Defense Command, that you're going to have A-12 sitting alert, well, think how long it takes you to get into the suit. And it's not like an F-4 that you ran out and you hit 2 gang switches, and a minute later both engines are running, and you're taxiing out, about to take off on this aligned runway. Once you start the A-12, start the SR-71, it took 20, 30 minutes to go through all the checks to make sure everything was right. So that's part of the determination. One of the good things that came out of it, though, it was a very classified program. Like I said, it knocked down targets over 100 miles away, launching missiles from 80,000 feet. They canceled the program, and Hughes was given permission, and they approached the Navy and said, we've been working in this garage in El Segundo, California. It's a little engineers with nothing to do on the weekend. We're working on this missile we think you might be interested in. You and I know it as the Phoenix. It was a missile developed for the A-12, and it worked wonderfully. So that missile, all the research that went into that, in fact, was transferred. The Navy never really knew the background of that particular, because the Tomcat is not going to launch a missile from 80,000 feet. It's going to launch a missile 30,000 feet, 40,000, but it gave it that range. Because at altitude, you got 100 miles out of it. The Tomcat got 40 to 50 miles out of it. So the YF-12A never built, but it served a good purpose for learning. Yes?
How many of these airplanes are in museums around the world?
Okay, right now, the 20 surviving SR-71s, 19 of them are here in the United States. One of them is at the Royal Air Force Museum at Duxford in England because of our European operations. The A-12s, there were 13 built. We lost 5 of them. The remaining 8 are here in different museums and around the country. The one surviving YF-12A is at Dayton, Ohio. There were 2 of them built to launch Mach 3 missiles. On the 4th flight, the missile collided with the airplane, and the launch engineer had never had water training. The ejection seats worked perfectly fine, but he drowned in the Pacific Ocean because he didn't know how to use his suit. So Kelly Johnson canceled that program that day. That one surviving airplane, if you go to the Museum of Flight up at Seattle, Washington, you'll see that airplane with the drone on its back.
The one is in local museum
Is 972 that set the number of records, world records. And there's another SR just down the road that they just moved from the Richmond Museum at the airport into the old Richmond train terminal, and it's hung from the ceiling, and it's got about 2 inches on one side and 3 inches on the other, because they couldn't put it in level. It's in a turn because it wouldn't fit in the main bay. Very cleverly mounted. They had to knock the back of the train station out, bring the airplane in, hang it, do all the work, and then build the back of the train station back in the back.
So, Buzz, I think we'll just wrap it up with one last question. Can you give us your view from the pilot's perspective of the strategic value of the SR-71? What were you told? What did you know then? What do you know now? And is there one flight that you would say was the most important or most valuable strategically from a Cold War perspective of the SR-71?
We have pretty good testing. We had pretty good knowledge of kind of what our role was. I would say probably the most important flights, and it would be more than one, was here, get this screen. Oh, okay. I can do that. Little wires. Little wires.
AT&T, we're hooked up again. Probably the most important was a series of flights. The flights that went into the Middle East for the president during the 1973 war, because he was getting no information from anywhere else. And as far as a strategic requirement to figure out how was the war going and what would be our role and what were the Russians doing and all the other stuff, that was probably the most important. The single probably most significant flight I felt I flew was again for the president into the Middle East during the 79 problems. We knew part of what the SR brought to the table was multiple. Satellites are predictable. You can know for the next 100 years where it's going to be at any time. You can plant decoys, you can hide stuff. You never know when an SR-71, a drone, a U-2, some type shows up that's unpredictable. And with the SR, it was the speed at which we could react and bring the information back. Today, you and I turn on the television and we may see a picture that was taken 10 or 20 minutes earlier because of data links. And they bring it to the decision makers in a much more timely fashion. You really had a sense of accomplishment when you came back. You enjoyed flying the airplane. It was a very demanding airplane to fly, but you enjoyed. There was no kibitzing. There was only a few people cleared on what we were doing and how to fly the airplane. We were very type A among ourselves. I mean, there was a lot of, after every flight, particularly overseas, because there were 3 crews at Kadena, we would talk to each other on what happened on that flight. Were there any things that you saw with that airplane, or in the, did you see something in North Korea? Did you see a particular reaction from Vladivostok that we hadn't seen before? So tried to keep the information up. But when you flew an operational sortie and you came back, When I first came in the program, we were not allowed to look at any of our pictures. We were not allowed to know where our targets were. And we finally convinced them, because most of us came out of RF-4s. Those are tactical reconnaissance F-4s that are full of cameras, no weapons. And we said, we kind of know where we are. We read the papers. And so they finally let us in, because we said, you know, if we can see the pictures, maybe we can fly the airplanes better to give you better photography, particularly. And so they finally relented, so we could come in afterwards and sit down with the photo analysts at the light tables and see. And what was really significant, once we got the synthetic aperture radars, particularly in Europe, not so much in the Far East, but in Europe, all the things you could see culturally because of the radar returns that we had never seen before, that don't necessarily show up that way in the photo things. But I would say that was probably your sense of accomplishment, that, and you were just glad that you had been selected and you made it through training. Because, let's say, every year we would wash out typically a pilot or a nav, and sometimes, like I said, we'd remove one that was in the program that wasn't keeping up to the standards that we felt needed to take place. I will stay up here afterwards. Thank you so much for supporting the Cold War Museum. Do visit the facility back there. It's a wonderful little museum with lots of interesting artifacts, but I'll hang around here for a little, but again, thanks for spending part of your Sunday afternoon and sharing this with the Cold War Museum.